Hello, my name is Lee Presser. This is my show. I speak frequently to very interesting people. Some of these conversations are so exciting, so intellectually stimulating, I thought others might like to listen in. This is the reason we started recording Conversation with Lee Presser.
Welcome to Conversation with Lee Presser. Is Western culture weakening? Is it weakening at the same moment as we see a reawakening in the Chinese culture? Is it weakening in the face of resurgent Russian authoritarianism and radical Islam? Do you think Western civilization is worth fighting for? Do you understand the difference between their thinking and ours? Our guest today is Professor Allison Thomason of Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville. She is a historian and researcher who teaches courses in world history and Western civilization, as well as the history and archaeology of the ancient Near East, Egypt, Greece, and Rome. About a month ago, she asked me what I meant by Western civilization. She reminded me that the origins are found in the Eastern Mediterranean, and before that, what we now call the Middle East. Today we're going to learn a little bit about where our culture began. Allison Thomason, thank you very much for coming today.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to
You're
be
a great
here.
teacher, I know, that even though I've never sat in your class, but just in asking me that question, by the way, it really got me to think in a different way than I had previously been thinking, which of course is the definition of a good teacher.
Well, thank you. Well, you know,
Yeah.
ask my students. They might not all agree, but especially when they get their exams back. Yeah.
There's students, and I think that you would do better. Just give these guys degrees at the first day.
Yes.
And then those that really wanted to learn something, then they'd hang around.
That's a thought. Although we have some great students at SIUE who are really dedicated to learning. Most of our students are. All of them, I should say.
Well, just so that people understand, I called you, I guess it was about a month ago, and I was looking to do basically a story here about Western civilization and what I perceive as a weakening in Western civilization in the face, and anybody who watches the news can see that that other parts of the world are really challenging the West now. And then when you asked me that question about, what is Western civilization, or, when we started talking about it, I was like, yeah, actually, I guess we really do need to think in those terms. And then you suggested these guys right here, these books.
Gave you homework, didn't I?
So, yes, she gave me this book here to read, which was by this Jared Diamond, which I thought was really excellent, and then another one about collapse. And so we're going to talk a little bit about this and then move on to some other subjects. But I'll do my oral exam now.
Yes.
And tell you what it was that
Okay.
I think that I learned from this.
Okay.
Somewhere about 40,000 years ago, human beings began to think and act differently than they had previous to that. And that was the beginning of what we now see as human civilization. And that this human civilization began to spread out, and I was surprised. There's a little, not a little, there is a graph in there, not a graph, a picture that shows the spread of human beings out of Africa and into other areas. And I was really surprised to see that in various parts of the world where you wouldn't expect, especially down in like Australia or New Guinea area, that's relatively recent, only maybe like 13,000 years ago, that people actually, human beings actually started crossing the waters and going to these places.
Right. I think they had to control the technology to cross the oceans and read the currents to do so. I'm actually surprised how early people peopled all the corners of the world, and how quickly you see the spread going from, say, mainland Asia all the way over to Indonesia and Melanesia and places like that. I'm actually thrilled by how quickly people catch on to new ideas and develop technology and work with the technology and innovate and adapt to their environments. And I see it happening quite quickly, actually.
That's interesting that, sometimes you talk to people and they think, oh, 100 years ago, oh, wow, what a long time ago. And I'm like, what are you talking about? A long time ago was, a couple thousand years ago.
Right.
And the more that I read history, the more it seems that, no, I'm wrong. It's actually, you got to go back 5,000, 10, now I'm back 13,000 years.
That's right.
Now, history, and you're a historian and you teach history, doesn't that really start when people first start writing things down? All the rest is just summation of what you think was right.
That's interesting, because I always begin every course that I teach with the question, what is history, and when does it begin, and when does it end? So, a second ago, is that history? And there's many different ways to define history and when it begins. And I think writing is a seminal moment, to be certain, but I see history stretching back before that. And I really think of history kind of like what you said, when humans first start developing civilization and the material culture that accompanies civilization, like tools and art and pottery and things like that. And to me, that there's several thousand years before writing.
Even more than that, if you
10,000.
believe
what
because Professor Diamond is saying. He's indicating, back to like 12,000 what we call
the
BC.
Neolithic. Yes.
Yeah. And so nobody's writing anything down there except for maybe some cave paintings in there.
Right, but they are thinking in symbolic ways beyond the written word, or in addition to the written word, or before the written word. So we do have artistic images, we have sculptures, we have pottery, which is a sort of creation of a storage, it's storage vessel. It starts as a way to prepare for the long term and store your grain, for example, over a long period of time, so that you always have grain ready, no matter what season it is in your agricultural cycle. So these sort of abstract thoughts I see happening as early as the Paleolithic age, but then that's around the 40,000 to 20,000 that you're speaking of. And then you get to about 12,000, 13,000 BCE. I say BCE. And that's, we could talk about that.
Yeah, we will, but finish your thought.
And that's when we start to see the so-called Neolithic or agricultural revolution occurring, when people were able to produce their own food. And that was essential.
And that was a big change for human beings. Prior to that, we were like wandering around looking for, oh look, there's a squirrel over there that we might be able to eat, or look, there's a coconut up there that we might be able to eat, or we were basically on the march constantly from place to place looking for food. And then comes this break point when all of a sudden people start thinking, wow, maybe we can just stay right here and keep making that wheat, or, well, of course, wheat is a relatively new product.
And my students always ask me, when and who invented agriculture? And it really was, well,
his name's not written down, is it? Or
I
her
was
name.
Here, right. And it really was there wasn't maybe, it was a long-term transitional period between hunting and gathering to what we call cultivation to full-blown food production agriculture, over a couple thousand years.
And that presumes, or they're presuming, that we made, as human beings, this transition where our society was here and then everybody was there. But in fact, that's not true.
Right.
You have those who are producing food out of the ground, and then they're attacked by the people who are still the hunter-gatherers. That, wow, there's something right there to get.
Right, so you have these experiments with agriculture occurring at the same time as others are doing the hunting and gathering economy, and it becomes a competitive thing. Which society wins out in the face of changes in nature or conflict with each other? And so over time, the so-called sort of food production in many parts of the world won out as the way to survive, basically, and to not just survive, but excel, to really develop. But in other parts of the world, and I think Diamond makes a good point about this, the food production regime doesn't work for a lot of reasons related to environment. So, it'd be really tough to be a food producer and an agriculturalist who farms and go into the middle of a very arid or semi-arid region and try to do that. So the people who live in zones that are not amenable to food production because of water sources have to adapt their own technology and their own innovations, and they do so very well. So I see it as agriculture didn't take over the world, but where it could occur, it certainly led to basically increasing population and competitive advantage, but not everywhere, that's for certain.
Now, we're going to, because time is relatively short here,
Yes.
we're going to have to summarize some stuff. Somehow, in an area that we now call the Middle East, or the Fertile Crescent, that people landed there. They wound up, creating homes and a whole food industry, and then developed culture. Actually, this culture developed for thousands and thousands of years before we ever come to anybody by the name of Homer. Or,
Yes,
or and people think it's,
Plato.
oh my God, that's like so far back there.
Yeah.
There's another one, the Kypria.
The Kypri are these other perhaps
Written by the Hittites or something like that, or
well,
but in other words,
right.
we're still. I mean, we're well past 2000.
Gilgamesh and
Yeah, I mean, it's like, first of all, let's get this BC or BCE
yes.
taken care of here. When I was young,
Yeah.
it was AD and BC.
Yeah, and it's still
now
is.
you talk different language. Why do we now say BCE or CE?
Well, it depends on which field you're in as well. So in anthropology, I see people using BCE and CE. CE meaning the common era, starting with an arbitrary zero, which we've all agreed on. It's the same zero as in the BC AD sequence. And then BCE, before the common era. And this is a nod to the fact that not everybody in the world, that is professional archaeologists or not, use the same arbitrary system of dating that we do.
Because the Jewish calendar goes back.
Exactly.
What is it? Over 5,000 years now.
Right.
The Muslim calendar, it starts somewhere in the 6th century, I believe.
The 600, right? 7th,
and
right.
so BC AD is actually was supposedly the time of Christ.
Right,
So we're
year of our
talking the
Lord,
Christian
right.
religion.
But the strange thing is we change the terminology. For example, when I write scholarly articles, we use BCE and CE in some journals, but we keep the arbitrary dating system. We keep the zero where zero is, which is
Because that's where we know it is.
because we've been using that
Right,
system, and
exactly.
it's sort of because of the nature of.
It's for the same reason that
Right.
America still uses English measurements instead of
There
metric.
you go.
We're used to it.
Scholarly and
We're-
historical
right,
tradition.
We're used to it.
That's
And
right.
I'm used to BC and AD, so if I say
Okay.
it.
I do it too. I do both.
In any case, things didn't even start getting written down till about, 2000? Is it 2000?
Well, I can give you a good date for this
Okay.
one, 3200 BC.
3200.
So that would
okay.
be about 5,000 years ago. And
So, but think about that. Think about how far back we just started talking about 11,000
Yeah.
BCE as a time when this transition to an agricultural economy begins, and these guys are doing art and they're doing containers, as you said, and so they're already thinking. And I suspect that those human beings, except for technology, are very similar to human beings of today.
Yes.
They lived similar lives.
Well, I'll tell you, we're all very concerned about money and keeping track of our money. And the first writing out of ancient Mesopotamia, southern Mesopotamia, which is probably the earliest written system in the world, they were receipts. They were, in and out deposit receipts and IOUs, and they were accounting documents. So right away, the reason writing was invented in Mesopotamia, at least, was to keep track of stuff. And we are still very much concerned with that. And for example, the sort of threat of cybersecurity and hacking and people getting into great retail systems, this just shows you that we are still very, very, very focused on keeping track of our stuff. and that's
Our
something
stuff's important to us.
Right, and it was important to the Mesopotamians.
Well, of
way
course,
back
you're
when.
talking about the leadership, the king, and
Yes.
the retinue around,
That's right.
around him,
Right.
as opposed to how that has diffused down to you and me, who,
Right.
unless we were born as royals, we wouldn't be involved in that at all.
That's exactly right. So we're talking about literacy here, and the Mesopotamian writing system was quite complex and sophisticated and difficult to learn, and very few people, even throughout the 3,000 years of using this script, it's called cuneiform, even through 3,000 years, very few people, maybe about 10% of the population at most, was literate, could read or write large, on a large scale. Some people could read a few letters or what we call signs at a time, but it was a very limited literacy, and the people who were literate were usually attached to the religious institutions, which we call temples, or the palaces where the kings resided. That's exactly
Keeping
right.
track of stuff.
Keeping track of stuff to show.
Or keeping people on track in culture.
Right. So taxes was the first documents in Mesopotamia were sort of like taxes, if you would, tax documents.
So now we've come down, even at that level of 3,200 BCE, see, I'm adapting to you, that people are like, wow, that's a long, long time ago. But when you consider that this 3,200 was long, long after 11,000 BCE.
Takes a long time to work some of these
But culture's
things out.
been building up this whole time. So by the time we start to write things down, it wasn't like they were just thinking of this stuff right then and there.
That's right.
Oral culture had brought all of the, so Western civilization, the beginnings of Western civilization, those areas that we call Assyria or Syria now, the Hittites, which we now call the Turkey,
Sumerians.
the Sumerians,
Babylonians.
yes, the Babylonians, the Israelites, all those folks who followed on after that, their culture, which eventually became what we know as Western culture, had developed from this period long, long before, over a series of not just hundreds, but thousands of years.
And you think about Homer. So the traditional date for Homer is around 750 BC, right? So that's a good almost, okay, my math, I'm not a math person, 2,000 or so years plus after the invention of writing in the Fertile Crescent. But Homer was living in an era where all these areas of the world that you just mentioned were in contact with each other, communicating with each other, sharing ideas, sharing written forms, sharing objects, sharing culture, coming into conflict with each other, trading with each other. And so when I read parts of Homer, especially the Iliad, I see a lot of ancient Near Eastern influence in that. And he's describing this very sort of international world where he's between the Near East and Greece in the description of especially the material culture that Achilles and others hold as they battle on the walls of Troy. And of course, Troy is traditionally located in Western Turkey. So even though it was a Hisarlik, Tepe Hisarlik, right? Even though it's predominated by Greek-speaking Trojans, they were very much in contact with, archaeologically speaking, the Hittites and other cultures of Western Turkey. Yeah, and we know this from archaeology found at Troy.
I'm going to break from what you just said to come to some of the things that I wanted to get out here. One, when you look around this room that we're in, when we look at the technology that we are using right now, most of this comes from Western culture.
Yeah.
Very little of the modern world seems to come from outside of Western culture. It is now, but it's almost like they're learning from us in the West, and then they are doing something, and perhaps, Chinese culture 100 years from now may in fact develop into something entirely new and different than it was. But right now it's a mimic of what Western culture has developed. And I just wonder what it is about these folks that we were just talking about, the people, the Mycenaeans, who are, proto-Greeks. What is it about them and the way that they thought that led us to the point where we think in these more curious terms rather than let's just leave the world the way it is and not progress forward?
So I think you're talking about innovation here. And
perhaps that is what I'm talking about. And the Western culture seems to be more innovative, and that Eastern culture seems to be more of a mimic.
I would disagree with you because I think it depends on where you look in history. But I think that at least in the Mediterranean area, the part of the world that first identified individual genius and, for example, started naming individual artists and authors was Greece. So in Mesopotamia, there were plenty of innovators and plenty of well-known I shouldn't say that, a few very well-known authors, but in general, the authors didn't sign their works, right? They were anonymous scribes.
Kind of like early movies, where they didn't list the cast in early movies. Go ahead.
Right. So, but the Greeks came along and they started signing their works of literature. They had named authors. And for example, even in their pottery, the painter or the potter would put his name on a beautiful vase that he was selling to an elite Greek person. And I think that focus on the individual and the idea that the individual has this sort of spirit inspired, at least for the Greeks, by the muses, which you would call so-called genius. I think that's what allowed the Greeks to focus on the individual. But I don't want to say the Greeks are more innovative than any other culture that I've studied, but the focus on individuals, the idea that individuals attain glory through their own personal deeds, albeit for the Greeks at least sort of circumscribed by the gods because they were a polytheistic society. I think
the gods themselves are named and therefore as individuals.
Right.
And all the names that people, if they've read the Odyssey or they've read the Iliad, those names which live down through history.
But for the Greeks, humans had this sort of movement within the fate that the gods decreed for them. And I don't see that as much in other societies I've studied, that it's up to the individual to make the choices to determine their fates. And I see that in the Greek world, and I also see it in the way Jared Diamond talks about collapse, for example, that human societies have certain decreed environmental spaces where they are in the world and they have to deal, but it's the individual choices that both individuals and societies make within that delimited space that makes some societies different from others, or what he calls fail or succeed. Of course, from my perspective, I see societies, quote, failing and succeeding on a regular basis in terms of the long stretch of history. So, for example, you mentioned that the Chinese are mimicking rather than imitating right now, and I couldn't tell you about the modern technology, but I could tell you that back in the medieval period, the West was the backwater, technologically speaking, and we were borrowing and mimicking the technology such as gunpowder and paper and other things from the Chinese back in the 1200s or something like that.
Something I learned that really shocked me is that of the first 20 centuries since the year 0, 18 of those centuries, China had the largest gross national product, GNP,
right,
of any other place in the world.
If you could measure such a thing, right?
And it's only starting in the 19th and then the 20th centuries did they go downhill as a society, and the West suddenly came up with a vengeance, and now
Technologically speaking, as your measure,
and wealth-wise.
Wealth, right.
And now they're back into the mode of, hey, we're collecting some wealth. And what most people don't seem to see is that they're actually like a straw. They're like sucking wealth away from the West. We're more, it's like, hey, yeah, we'll start sending stuff over to Walmart. You send your money to us. And that's my vision of this transition. We got about 3 minutes, believe it or not.
Okay.
Our time's gone
Wow.
by. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you would like to say?
Just this notion of Western civilization. So I see the world today, and I actually see the world from the ancient past as one of very much interconnectedness. So saying that Homer was part of the Near Eastern world as much as he was part of the Greek world, to me that shows you that ideas about globalization and exchange and communication and trading ideas and innovation, the world was just as interconnected, I think, several thousand years ago.
Yeah.
And so can we really define West from East? I did pinpoint this idea of innovation and individual genius being important to the Greeks. But of course you could find exceptions in either space in the world, West or East. And I always have seen the world as interconnected and never entirely isolated and separated.
And yet Diamond addresses this, but I was going to say, and yet in different parts of the world, we use the term, some have succeeded, others have not, they do not have a lot of earthly goods or wealth, or the drive to learn new knowledge, as opposed to living the way that my parents and grandparents and great-grandparents lived. There seems to be some difference there. Some parts of the world, they just want to live on their laurels. Other places, they don't. They want to innovate and do something new.
Well, I see each society in the world adapting to their circumstances, and even surviving in some parts of the world is extraordinarily innovative compared to, for example, the U.S. is so well endowed with resources. So for me, again, I see connection and I see survivability and I see success measured not necessarily always in wealth, but in adaptation to the particular circumstances that one encounters in this place called Earth.
Yeah, I think we're going to have to, unfortunately, I mean, I wish that we could go on with this. When he being the guy over there behind the camera gave me that time cue that said it was 10 minutes left. I was like, oh my God, we're running out of time.
It went quick, as you said.
Well, you're coming back. That's all there is to it.
Oh, okay.
Thank you very much for being with us today.
It was a
Appreciate
pleasure.
it.
Thank you, Lee.
And time is running out, so I'll say really, really, really quick. I've been talking to Allison Thomason from SIU History Department. This is going on YouTube. Take a look again. Show it to your friends. Bye.